So good morning, everyone. And in advance, excuse me if I have a sort of shared attention at some point, as for now, I'm doing the pushing the button to let people into the room. So I will try to devote my full attention to the conversation with Wayne, but the 5% of my awareness will be directed to the lobby so that people are not stuck waiting outside, which is a terrible feeling to feel that you're almost there and you're not let in after all. So good morning and welcome to this Friday morning webinar. I'm happy that you decided to spend your Friday morning maybe leaving earlier, maybe deciding to show up later at your office, or maybe like I know some of the people here sitting in your office with a whole team around you, eager to listen to what Wayne is going to talk about today. The way that we structured this is that it's not going to be a presentation. We're going to have a conversation, and so I will be asking Wayne a couple of questions here and there, and he will be telling about himself and his method, and we'll also get around the workshop in November and what's going to happen there. And in about half an hour, we'll open the floor so that whoever has remarks, comments, questions to put in will be able to do that in about half an hour. So until then, I hope that you enjoy yourselves and your coffee, your croissants, whatever you are pleasing yourself with. And Wayne Visser, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here, as they say, right? In modern day virtual language, because you're not actually here, but in a way we are, right? So I wanted to start out by
before we jump in to the questions. It would be interesting for me just to see who's on the call. So maybe in the chat, people can just say who they are and where they're calling in from, or who they're associated with. That's interesting for us.
Yeah, great. Well, good idea. So anyone or everyone, please be very welcome to write in the chat who you are, what you do, what you're associated with, if anything, and yeah, why you're here. That way I can also keep letting people in. So we have a nice number of people showing up already. That's great. So Wayne, I wanted to start out by asking you to give a little brief story about who are you, how did you get here?
Okay, well, again, thank you for having me on this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to the workshop, and we'll talk about that. But I have quite a long journey in sustainability. I got involved when I was a student, a business student in Cape Town, South Africa. I was born in Africa, and it was the time in the lead up to the Rio Earth Summit. And so we got together as youth at that stage, and we got together from all around the world in Tokyo, in Japan, and prepared youth input to the Rio Earth Summit. And it's worth reflecting back on that, because at that time we were already clear. We felt on the problems. There were big problems, but we felt they were very manageable, that there seemed to be some momentum from politicians. Business was starting to get interested. And so we were actually quite optimistic. And this is now 30 plus years ago. Anyway, we sort of know how history has unfolded, and I've been involved in sustainability ever since. I've set up and run KPMG's sustainability services. I run now Cambridge University's Business Sustainability Management course. I have a chair in Sustainable Transformation at Antwerp Management School, and so on. But what's been interesting being with the movement for so long is seeing how it's changed, and it really has changed. So in some ways we're a victim of our own success because there is more going on than ever before. If you're, as I'm sure many of you are, trying to keep track of what's going on, it really is prolific, both from the policy side and from business side. And paradoxically, many of the problems are getting worse. So it means we're more active, but we haven't solved the problems. And that's been my question I've wrestled with the whole time I've been involved, is what are we either not doing enough of, or what are we doing wrong? Because, you should judge a patient, if you're a doctor, by whether they're getting better or not by how much, you're prescribing in terms of medicine. So that's where we're at. And in a lot of my work, therefore, I've been calling for, concepts like corporate social responsibility and then sustainability to be reformed, both in the way that we conceive them and in the way that we practice them. And that more or less brings us up to date. We're in I think, a very exciting moment where sustainability itself, I think it's run 25 plus years. It also hasn't worked. We have people like John Elkington, who coined the triple bottom line and who I know quite well, withdrawing it as a failed management concept. And when you speak to him about that, he says it's not that's going away. When you do a car recall, you put them back out on the road once you've fixed the problem. So it's more that we have to reframe it. And a lot of my work around thriving is around that reframing. So what is it that we need to do differently, that we need to do more of, in order that we can actually start to turn the corner on these global challenges?
Yeah, so can you thanks for flying us all the way in here and up here and up to date. Can you try and give us a little sort of breakdown on what is the relation to you between sustainability, regeneration, and thriving?
Yeah, so I just did a webinar the other day called "Sustainability, Is It a Sham?" And it's essentially the same question, which is, what is sustainability? I think the difference is that the way that sustainability has been practiced is in two ways. One, firstly, that it's been conceived as this triple bottom line where we're trying to get a balance between people, planet, and profit. So that old Venn diagram, and sustainability is the magic spot in the middle. And that is just scientifically false. We are in a system, a living system, where the economy is entirely dependent on society. So it's nested within society. And society is entirely dependent on nature, again, nested. So what we've really got is three concentric circles. So that's the one way in which I think if sustainability was conceived and understood and practiced that way, we would have less of an issue with it. But it's not, especially if you deal with business. You'll always hear them talking about, oh, well, we need to balance, the sort of environmental impacts with the social impacts and the ecological, the economic. And you see that with the policymakers now. I mean, what's happening with Rishi Sunak here in the UK, it's just disastrous. What's happening in Sweden, it's the same logic. Well, we can't harm the economy too much. We have to balance it. So that's the one issue. The second issue is that, again, the way that it's been practiced a lot is that sustainability has been seen as doing less harm. It's been minimizing the damage. At least that's true, especially on environmental issues, but I would say also to a large extent on social issues. It's been about, having less of the bad labor practices, not doing away with bad labor practices. And so here we start to get a difference with thriving. So thriving is saying it's beyond less bad. It's recognizing that in the last 50 years, particularly, we've done so much damage, both in society and to nature, that we can no longer afford just to sort of try to do less damage each year, but continue to do damage. We actually need to repair and restore. And, that's the idea of thriving across. I've got 6 dimensions, which we'll talk about, 6 great transitions. We need to up our game. We need to be more ambitious. And between thriving and regeneration, we could have a very pedantic argument about differences, but for all intents and purposes, for me, they're the same. Regeneration has tended to be more applied to ecological spheres and especially to agriculture, of course, but we start to see it in architecture and other things. It's been more narrowly interpreted, and thriving has tended to be, in its use, applied often more to human dimensions. But if I'm honest with you, the title of my book, Thriving, which I'm delighted will be out in Danish soon, was Regeneration. And then I found out that Paul Hawken was about to come out with a book called Regeneration. So I got a hold of Paul, and we sort of agreed to use different labels, but essentially for the same thing, even though he comes at it in a different way, but very complementary. The same, I should throw in another bit of jargon there with net positive. I think that's more or less the same thing. That's, of course, the language of Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston. Although, again, I've spoken to Andrew about this, you get into that trade-off territory when you talk about net something, because that means on balance, it needs to be positive. And that was never their intention.
Yeah, because to me, there's something in all of this about how you handle the process, right? That, you could have a goal of which would be like having a positive impact, right? Which would be in alignment in some ways, at least, with a regenerative approach. But then, in my opinion, you would easily fall back to just actually starting out with doing less harm, because you're trying to sort of reduce the pain until at some point you cross zero and you end up in a positive place, right? How do you do with that?
Yeah, I totally agree, right? If you're a patient and you're bleeding profusely, the first thing you do is you stop the bleeding, and then you take care of recovery. But it is about the difference of the goal. The goal should be full health, vitality, and also, they don't have to be sequential. So yes, anything we can do to minimize the harm, to stop doing that harm. If you're digging a hole, as we are, a very big hole, you need to stop digging first before you climb out. But, we know that at the same time where we're stopping the harm on some activities, we can at the same time be restoring and regenerating in other areas. And I think we see some companies, starting to adopt that as well. As to how, it is a whole process, and one of the things we'll work through in the workshop is what I call integrated value management. It's a 6-step process, and it gets very practical, but you have to start with understanding the system that you're part of, and we'll actually spend half a day understanding that system through some systems mapping and scenarios. We have to, really listen to what the stakeholders are needing and wanting through materiality assessment. You have to really think deeply about what your values are and your ethics, and make sure that those are aligned with the system and the stakeholder needs. And then it comes down to bold strategic goals. And we have to look at KPIs and metrics. And then there's an element of innovation, and in order to get to those ambitious goals. And we'll deal with all of those. And that's a sort of process. I've been working with Johnson & Johnson now for 4 or 5 years, where we've been working through those steps to implement them.
The ones with the baby oil.
Yes, well, they do a lot more than that. They also
do a lot more than that. But
COVID vaccine, and they have. I mean, they have a consumer element, but they have a big sort of pharmaceutical element as well, and so on. But yes, that company.
Yeah, because I was thinking about just down that line exactly about sort of what are the good cases, what are the where can we turn to see this working in practice? What are the examples that you look at that you're trying to follow?
Well, of course, we always have to caveat this to say there is no perfect company,
Of course not.
And we can take inspiration, nevertheless, from certain practices of certain companies. Some of them are I would say, the usual suspects. So, I think Patagonia is always an inspiration. I think Unilever and IKEA do some things right, which we can learn from. I think that Ørsted is a very interesting case in terms of transformation, and we'll probably go into that, what we can learn from that a little bit more in the workshop. But interestingly, a lot of the examples that I track and use and feature in the book are more the innovation startups.
Right.
Because, can the dinosaurs evolve and adapt? To some extent they maybe, but the really exciting innovations are tending to be among the startups. So, whether that's companies like in the alternative protein space, lots that's interesting going on there. Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and so on, but also increasingly now in the cellular agriculture and the precision fermentation space, even more exciting. A lot going on in terms of biofabrication. Companies like Algix, which is using algae to produce filament that can be 3D printed, or Biomason, that literally grows bricks at room temperature using biological materials. So fascinating things going on there. Also, some of them very community based. An example like Barefoot Solar. So there's the Barefoot College in India,
right.
and they take people from low-income communities in rural areas, and they train them within 3 to 6 months to be solar engineers and to go and kit out their whole village with a solar lighting system. Some bigger companies. I mean, another company I've done work with is Umicore. It's a Belgian-based company. Used to be a mining company, had operations all around the world, and then made a strategic shift 20 or 30 years ago to say we're going to do urban mining, and today is probably one of the biggest precious metals recyclers in the world.
Right. Okay.
It's a plant in
urban mining.
And then we have to look on the social side as well. So companies like Chobani, which is the biggest maker of Greek yogurt in the US, and Hamdi Ulukaya, their CEO, who really focuses on diversity and inclusion. Many in his workforce are migrants and refugees. Tech startups like Hello Tractor, which is basically Uber for tractors in Africa, so that you get participation from everybody. Everybody can have access to agricultural equipment. Zipline, also in Africa, using drones to deliver medical medicines and so on in Rwanda. Planet Labs using satellites to image the Earth in detail every day so that we can see changes immediately, like deforestation, and so on. I can go on, but you get the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just thinking while you were talking about these things that the more you mention, the more my optimism grows, in a sense, right? I mean, I know all the things that are wrong, but there's something. So here's a question: how do you become a possibilist?
Yes, and I should pay credit where it's due. I think the person who coined that term is Hans Rosling, the great statistician and founder of Gapminder. But it is about tuning in to what is going well, and that's a lot about knowing and tracking the innovation space. And that was probably my one of two objectives in writing the book, was just to collect everything that's going on, because it streams into my inbox every day and I get very excited. But when I speak to people and when I just read the news headlines, of course, it's easy to get depressed and to think that everything is hopeless. And so that's part of it. It's balancing up what we're reading in terms of the science and sometimes the politics, which can be depressing, but then seeing the innovation. The other part, though, is understanding how change works. And that's been a big part of my career. I've been a student of change. How do complex living systems change? And as we all know, it's not linear. But that's frustrating, because it seems for a long time as if things aren't moving at all. But then we reach this inflection point, this tipping point. And so change is always exponential. And if you look at the work of Rethink X, people like Tony Seba, they track the cost curves of innovations. And when you do that, you can predict fairly accurately which industries and which product categories are in decline and which are rising. And it allows you to take a slightly longer term but more accurate perspective. I give you a very real example. I was speaking at the Energy Asia conference in Malaysia a couple of weeks ago, and it had sustainability in the subtitle. Massive conference, really who's who of energy in Asia. And it was opened by the Malaysian president. Okay, that's to be expected, but he was saying, we're fully committed to oil and gas. Second speaker was the Secretary General of OPEC. And the third speaker was the CEO of Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil company and the biggest company in the world. So you sort of got a flavor for what they were focused on, and the message was all the same. The world needs oil and gas. We're planning to grow it as much and as fast as possible. And of course, we're committed to net zero. Same sort of nonsense as Richie Sunak comes up with now. So when you hear that, then it's very easy to get depressed. But when you stand back and you look at the trends and you understand the sort of way that new technologies start to create virtuous cycles, so they start to have lower costs, better feedback, public acceptance, more investment, higher margins, and the the legacy technologies like oil and gas start to have higher costs, less public acceptance, lower revenues, lower margins, then, you know, they get into a death spiral. And so you start to have a different and a more hopeful perspective on that. But I will just say as well that being positive, or sometimes I prefer to think of it as being hopeful, which is the possibilist idea, right? It's that change is always possible. It's not that change has happened. We have to work at it. Hope is an action verb. It must be based in action. But that is also an attitude. It's a state of mind. It's a way that you choose to live in the world.
Great. So let's let's dive into the workshop that we'll be doing in November. How do you get all these points across to a group of participants?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that the reason we choose a workshop format is because we want people to work on these issues collectively. And what I do together with my partner Indira, who will be co-facilitating the workshop, is we have a frame and a process for going through, and we have 2 days, so we can really get into depth. But what we do is we start with that reframing, and we have the 6 great transitions that we need to go through in nature, society, and the economy. And we make sure that everybody understands what those transitions are. We then have thriving cards, a deck of cards based on the 36 elements of thriving, and we start to work with those cards. And the key at the start is actually the first step of integrated value management, which is all about systems thinking, understanding the system, or we say rethinking patterns. And so we work with those cards to try to tease out, in the areas that the participants are working in, what are the connections between these transitions, between these different elements of thriving. We do some systems mapping between those. We also will probably do some scenario development, it's a sort of a generative state that we want to get into, a creative state to also imagine what is the future we're trying to create and that we think is possible. So that's where we start, and then we make sure that we work it through then. So we will ask people to choose their organization or a project, and then in groups to help each other to work through on those. And we will go through a stakeholder materiality step. We will look at values and how they relate. We'll draw on Hofstede, for example, and his organizational values spectrums on that. We will then have a step around the strategic goal setting and around a little bit around reporting. Again, reporting is one of those areas where so much is happening, and it's really exciting. Actually, it's a bit overwhelming, but not only the CSRD, the reporting directive of Europe, but also the new standards on science-based targets for nature and reporting in that sphere have been launched, and so we'll probably get into those a little bit. And then spend a good half a day, a morning, I would say, on the innovation piece, really thinking about what innovations are needed and might already be in development among the participants. And then we end with an afternoon really on leadership, because that's what it comes down to in the end. And a lot of my work has been on researching leadership through the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and also through my doctoral research. So we'll get into that. What are the different types of leaders? What are the characteristics we need? We will allow people to self-diagnose what kind of leader they are and others in the group, and then we'll see if we've got a balanced group or an unbalanced group. And
what's that? Can I stop you there? What's the difference between a balanced group and an unbalanced group?
Well, one of the frameworks we'll work with, one that I've developed, is the Purpose-Inspired Leaders Framework. And I found through my research, where I applied existential psychology to people working in sustainability, was that the deep satisfaction reveals different types of leaders. We're all trying to make a difference, but we're coming at it quite differently. And there are 4 types. There's an expert type, facilitator, a catalyst, and an activist. And so we sort of reveal that for ourselves in the workshop. And then we see, and what you tend to find is that in any group, it's often quite unbalanced. You're often missing a certain category largely. And if you're trying to make change happen, you really need all the different types because they all bring something different. And there are other frameworks we'll work with, Malcolm Gladwell's individuals that are needed for a tipping point. There are three different types of individuals there. And so, yeah, that's what we will work with a little bit. And then the last piece is just we call it unfolding the change. It's another little methodology for taking the actions we've been working on and just sort of making a plan for how they might unfold, what all the different steps you would need to make them real.
Fantastic. I mean, to me, it really makes sense in the way that we're actually sort of so moving from creating sort of a room full of mapping, and then adding sort of palimpsest layers on top of that with all the different aspects and focus areas that you bring in, and then somehow condensating while still being in that map space, the different innovation processes or ideas or projects that people can develop, and then landing in a place where, because a lot of the resistance that I find that I meet in everyday life is that people know what they want to do, right? But then there's every day, right? And then all the structures come in and all the nitty-gritty, tedious obstacles that you meet, and if it's possible somehow to come out with tools to that can help a little bit in how you approach some of all those everyday obstacles, I think is hugely interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things we'll work through, as well as the 6 underlying principles, scientific principles of thriving, which are really a distillation of system science. And I find that they give us great clues on how to work within the system, because if we consistently try to apply those principles to whatever situation we're in, we can feel confident that we're moving in the right direction. So we'll work with those as well.
Okay, so my last comment would be that now I feel like I'm in sort of Buckminster Fuller kind of territory, right? Trying to create a thriving alternative rather than fighting the existing norms.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, and I love that you mentioned Buckminster Fuller. He's been a great inspiration, and in fact, one of the concepts I've worked a lot with also in my research is synergy, which he was very big on. I think he called it synergetics, and that's part of the answer. Actually, is what you're looking for is who can you partner with, combine with, in order to create synergies where the outcome is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's one of the ways that you can work within the system, that you have to work really is collaboratively. It's one of those underlying principles. But I think it is staying focused on the solutions and working towards that, but also understanding the system well enough that you can maneuver within the system, because we're not idealists in the sense of, you know, ignoring the reality. It is tough, and we have to, you know, find all sorts of tactics and strategies to keep on moving forward and creating that future.
Great. I think I'll now try to do two things at one time, which is always a bad idea. But I'll try and see anyone who would like to ask, or yeah, if anyone has a question for Wayne.
So there's
based
one
on what you've heard already.
There's
Yeah,
one in
sorry.
the chat. So while you,
Oh, great.
sort of unmute people while I answer this one. Oh, the second one came through. So
Wonderful.
the chat's working quite well. So Anna's asking, can I be more specific about Unilever and IKEA? And it would be interesting to know what's behind your question,
Right.
whether you're interested in that, or whether you have some critical views about Unilever and IKEA. So again, let me say that none of these companies are perfect, but the thing that I often use Unilever for is the step that they really got right under Paul Polman when he took over as CEO was the strategy step. You'll probably all be familiar with the Sustainable Living Plan. And that 10-year plan really meant that they left other companies in the dust when it came to at least perceptions of their sustainability. And it was about setting very ambitious but very clear goals. What I find in working with companies is every company has strategic goals, but mostly they have too many of them. And so they're not able to communicate clearly to their organization or to the public, to their stakeholders, what are the big things where they're going to make a real difference. And Unilever was able to do that under Paul Polman. And as a result, I think they moved a lot in that time. They grew their more sustainable brands. They grew at twice the speed and ended up being more than half of the profits of the company. So there's a lot to unpick there. Also, Paul Polman, there's a lot to say for him as a leader. I think he has been exceptional. And when we look into the characteristics of sustainability leaders, we can use him as a case as well to say, what did he do right? Interestingly, since he left, I think that Unilever's lost some of that focus. They still have ambitious goals, but it's I couldn't tell you today what are the main goals that they have. Whereas when Paul Polman was there, I could. So that's interesting as well. Leadership really matters. IKEA is interesting for a number of reasons. They also have been pretty good at that strategic goal level. If you look at their people, planet, positive strategy, it's quite clear and it's quite ambitious. But I also use them quite a lot on innovation. In fact, I teach a course on sustainable innovation at Antwerp Management School, and we have them as the case. And I know the people in IKEA who are head of innovation in the Inca group, the global group that IKEA is part of. And so we get them in talking about how they're trying to innovate all the time. They have very strong visions around circular economy, especially. So there's lots that's interesting there. They have dilemmas, of course. You're trying to be a low-cost provider and be sustainable. You really feel that tension, and they're wrestling with that. Principles of thriving is the next question from Kirsten.
Yes,
we will go into them in more detail in the workshop, but there are 6 principles of thriving, which are complexity, circularity, creativity, coherence, convergence, and continuity. And we'll obviously unpack what each of those means. They all start with a C, so that's one way to remember it. but they each mean something quite specific in the science. For example, complexity in system science doesn't mean that it's complicated. It means that there are lots of relationships. That's what complexity is, lots of connections. Convergence, we talk a lot about the positive feedback loops and how that accelerates change in particular areas. Coherence, we talk about purpose, especially, that unifies, and so on.
Okay, great. And as you say, we'll get much more in depth of that. And of course, anyone can also either buy the existing, but the English book, or wait for the Danish book to come out in not very long, at least in time for the workshop in November. And we have a question from Jeppe around the health sector perspective, where you could say a lot of things, right? But Jeppe is asking for inspiring examples.
Yeah, and I have worked quite a bit with this sector. Let me first say I think they really are struggling. So they do have some ambitions, for example, around renewable and circular. This is one of the areas I've been working with J&J on, and there are some hospital groups that have made a lot of progress. For example, on net zero, there are some that have already met net zero. On renewables, the Janssen Pharmaceutica plant in near Antwerp is fully geothermal on its energy. They're starting to look, but it's really tough at how do you make medical products and medical equipment as well circular. Now, one of the things on the equipment side is a sort of lease rather than buy model, which can save a lot. Packaging is a real issue, because there is a health element for why we package medicines the way we do. And there's the difficult thing, of course, is that when we ingest medicines and all of that gets into the water and we get hormone disruptors and so on, that's another big one to deal with, and they haven't really figured that out, but they start to look at different components. There is some interesting work, I would say, on moving to prevention, which is really important. So instead of just treating the symptoms, can we work much more on health education? And that's really investing in thriving from an individual point of view. So there's quite a bit of work on that. Work on using biological elements. So a lot, working with indigenous communities and ensuring that there is payment for any natural ingredients that are sourced from indigenous communities as they get moved into medicines. So there's quite a lot going on, but it's a tricky one.
And Jeppe's question was also directed towards leadership and how you can attract and sustain the workforce in the health sector, which is one of the issues that we've also been talking about a lot in a Danish context.
Yeah, I think this is where our economics are so wrong, because some of the people that we really should be valuing in the health sector are not economically valued, especially if you look at nurses and others. We often have a system, here in the UK, of course, we've got the NHS, which in some ways is amazing because it's a free health for everyone, but in other ways is completely dysfunctional. So I don't think we've got that right. And so we've definitely got a lot of people in the health sector suffering from burnout, and in the case of the UK, again, striking because they're just not getting paid enough. So there are lots of issues about whether that the way that we've constructed the health institution is in any way sustainable, because you get a lot of people burning out. It's under-resourced. Tends, when you start to nationalize it, has lots of inefficiencies. If you privatize it, then you lose the access. So I think it is a challenging one, and I think what you raised there, can they attract and sustain talent is a real challenge. People are attracted to it because they often want to make a difference, but how much will you sacrifice personally in order to do that? So that's a little bit of needing to change policy and reward correctly the right things. In terms of, we talk in economics about externalities, and we often think of negative externalities like pollution, but we should also be thinking about positive externalities like those that work in the health sector and what they bring to society, and they should be rewarded accordingly.
It sort of latches on to the next question, which had to do with the construction section from Anita, because now you're talking about policy, right? So do you do any work around or with I was about to say legislators, but that's sort of that's called lobbying. How do you handle that sort of relation between looking for legislative measures such as legislation on recycling of materials in the construction industry and working from within? It can become to some extent, I suppose, it can become an excuse, right, for not acting.
Yeah, mainly, besides coming at it from a research perspective as an academic, mainly I've engaged through what we call corporate leaders groups. So at Cambridge, we set up many years ago the Corporate Leaders Group on Climate Change, and the whole point of that was to have a very diverse group of companies represented by their CEOs, so senior level commitment, who are actually looking for more progressive legislation. So that's the criteria for them joining together, and giving the politicians some political space, because they will often be less ambitious in their policy because they expect business to lobby against them. So when you work with these groups of companies, you can often say, okay, here's a voice of business that is not fighting against any legislation that you might come up with, but rather asking for better legislation and working productively with you as politicians to improve that. And there is so much, you mentioned, recycling building materials, Anita, there's so much that we can improve on still. The whole recycling area in Europe is still fraught with problems. Often it's about how materials are classified. So, if you try to send some materials across a border to recycle, and they classified as waste, then you actually are restricted in various ways. So there are all kinds of bugs in the system. But in the buildings sector, there's a lot we can do that can help. Recycling building materials is one, having requirements for that. Interestingly, there, I think we've got a lot of the solutions already in voluntary standards, and so it's a case of the legislators saying, all right, well, we've been working with LEED or with BREEAM for so many decades, and so we will just start to make it a requirement that we start to see that, in new housing developments in many countries. You have to have solar, you have to have a minimum energy efficiency, and if we can start to have things around circularity there as well, that will help. There are some good examples of legislation also in some parts of the world. Here in the UK, we've got something called the net gain legislation for construction, where it's not yet a regulation, but it's been put forward as a proposal. It seems to be advancing. You basically have to show that you have a net positive impact on nature in your construction. So that's and there's a methodology for how you also measure that. So that's quite positive. And there are other standards like the well building standard is one, and there are several others that I think give real inspiration. But it helps if the legislators kind of give it a push.
Okay, I have a very specific question for you from Lucy. It feels almost like she's having this dialogue already. I don't know if she is, but if you had a large bank in front of you, what would be your dream to do with them?
Yeah, we love banks. And in fact, we have worked with banks. India has been working with a large Austrian bank. One of the things I think that the banks have to deal with is they have to be very clear on the ESG agenda, and they have to understand what's going on with the ESG backlash that's been happening in the last couple of years. Now, partly that's politicized, especially in the States. That's actually very politically motivated, and actually some research suggests it's been covertly funded by the oil and gas industry to have that backlash, and it's associated with the Republicans now as well. So you have to understand that context and probably see through it and say, okay, that's not a good reason not to pursue. And then on the other hand, have to really acknowledge that there has been a lot of greenwashing from the financial industry, where funds that have been ESG funds really have been not very credible. And so working with a bank, the main thing is to get to the core of the business and to say, okay, are we very, very clear on the screening criteria that we have for our loans and our investments? And are we prepared to be bold on that? Do we have a clear approach? So are we going to take a shareholder activism approach, where we're going to stay invested in companies that need to change, but really push them from the inside as their sort of financiers? Or are we going to take an exclusionary approach where we start to disinvest from certain sectors? A lot of it is also then about, can you fund the solutions? And I always find it remarkable that when I speak to innovators and small business startups working in circular economy or elsewhere, they always say we can't get financing. And then when I speak to banks, they say we can't find projects. And so there's something going on there. There's a mismatch. So I think working a lot on how you can proactively fund and scale the solutions that we need has to be a big part of the work, and not getting distracted by things that are important but are not the core business. Of course, banks have lots of buildings. You need to make sure they're efficient. You want to recycle your paper and so on. Look at your travel, but that's not the core issue. The core issue is what's happening to the money, and are you able to create incentives which are amplifying the speed of change.
I was reading in one of the many reports that an assumption or an evaluation saying that around 50% of the carbon problem that we have, so to say, comes from investing. So it's the impact, the question of impact investment is a huge one, and so far it's happening in a not very transparent manner.
Yeah. So the first step, to be clear on the answer, would probably be to work with that criteria that you're using, and then the portfolio, and really to work through that in a lot of detail. I think I'm answering too slow because we got a backlog of questions. So how can big companies put regeneration at the heart of creating value, encourages? Yeah, I mean, Anna, I think this comes down a lot to leadership, that they need to embrace regeneration as a main principle, and not too many have done that yet. They're still a little bit on the sustainability thing, which can mean so many things, or they're tied to the SDGs. So we need a few leaders who stand up and say, okay, we're going for thriving, or we're going for regeneration, and that means something different. And then you track it through in the 6 great transitions to what it would mean in each of the areas, dealing with ecosystems, resources, health, diversity, technology, and resilience. So, a question from Ida.
Ida, I will. Ida was asking about short texts and podcasts and so on. I can put together a compilation. Of links and stuff. There's lots out there.
I've done a series on 3BL Media of summaries of the different elements of thriving, and we can share some of those articles that look at the different elements. Richard, you brought up Max Neef. I'm so glad you have. I got to meet him several times. I spent a couple of days at his home in Chile. And such an inspiring guy. So the main thing, the difference between his human scale development, or basic model of human needs, and Maslow is that Maslow always saw it as a hierarchy, and Manfred Max Neef, Chilean economist, worked a lot with people in poverty, and what he noticed was that there is no hierarchy. So although of course, you need food and water and maybe a bit of shelter to survive, and nobody's arguing about that. Beyond that, you can be, extremely poor. You can have really trying circumstances and still have what Maslow would call self-actualization. And so he came up with 9 fundamental human needs. A great contribution was he worked a lot on the difference between needs and satisfiers. So we get them confused. We think the thing that is satisfying a need is the need, but it's not. And he showed how the same need can have very different satisfiers. So if I've got a need for belonging, I can buy a Mercedes because I want to feel that I belong to the rich class, or I can join a choir, and they're quite different, but they satisfy the same need. And then he also showed how there are quasi-satisfiers, so things that we think are meeting our needs, which really are not, and that sometimes something that meets one need is inhibiting our ability to meet another need. So he's got a beautiful little book called Human Scale Development. I think it's called, if I remember, very short book where he elaborates on that. And he came up with that after he fell down the stairs, and he suddenly he knocked his head, and then he had this great idea. So interesting. So Anita, just making a great comment that some of the things we're relearning. I know when I speak to my dad, both my mom and my dad are from farming backgrounds in Africa, and I talk about regenerative agriculture, and I explain it to him, and he says, but we just called that farming. We've forgotten some of the common sense things. So Max Neef, we've answered. He was called the Barefoot Economist, and he has another book on I think it's called Barefoot Economics. And then from Greg, focusing on weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge debate right now, and you'll see the movement, right? There's a huge anti-fossil fuel movement that's building, and the backlash to that. So fossil fuels really doubling down. You know, we had a time 10 years ago where we were still saying maybe fossil fuel companies are changing. Maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt. They're investing a bit in renewables. What they've done now is unmasked themselves and really shown that they are far more interested in milking the cow as long as they can. So in growing oil and gas for as long as they can, arguing that there is a need for it. And so I think the fossil fuels divestment movement is very important, a very important part of the transition. It's part of that old versus new technology cycle I was talking about. We need to continue to take away the social license to operate of fossil fuel companies. Not that we're not all dependent on them, right? And not that we're saying the people in there are evil. It's just that the negative consequences of continuing fossil fuels in the way that they want to is just disastrous for the planet and for society. And so we have to, since they're not voluntarily doing it, we have to do everything we can, I think, to make it hard and to send them into the decline that they need to go into, and by implication also invest and champion as much as we can in the alternatives of renewables and green hydrogen, green ammonia, and other things like that.
Okay, great. I think we just have time for the last one from Kirsten Marie, because that's such a beautiful question to ask to end with. What's the best argument for going the thriving way?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in some ways it's a strange question, isn't it? But it's a very legitimate question, because many businesses do need convincing, and that's weird, right? It's like saying, I need to convince you to do more than breathe. Surely you wake up in the morning and you want to do more than breathe, right? So I think it is about, I would say, when I speak to business, I would say that thriving is an agenda for innovation, and that's exciting in a lot of ways. One, because it means you're part of bringing solutions. Two, it means that you're in growth markets rather than declining markets. Three, it means that you're attracting and retaining the best talent, because they want to work for companies that are bringing solutions and that are on the right side of history. So that's the argument I would make, is that this is the new transformation, and it's a little bit like if you were in America in 1900 and you started to see these strange looking very clunky cars emerging, what's the argument for changing from horse-drawn carts to cars? Well, you might say, well, we're doing fine with horse-drawn carts, but on the other hand, if you can see that this is a new technology that's evolving, you want to be on that side. And so, I think this is also a lesson for us. We've got to be careful not to be anti-new technology just because it's new and there are lots of uncertainties. Everything that's going on with AI right now is a case in point. We do need to be cautious. We do need to build in safeguards. We do need to make sure that a few companies don't dominate the space. But AI has so many upsides that we need to embrace it and then shape it to actually bring solutions to our problems.
All right, great. So
Good.
Thank you to everyone for all your comments and questions. And please feel welcome. Whatever thoughts you might have afterwards, whatever questions you might have, get hold of me, text me, mail me, whatever, and we'll keep everything in mind. It's all an ongoing dialogue, right? We of course we hope to see as of the people here as possible present in November. But it's also just about continuously maintaining the dialogue between ourselves and all the wonderful people that we work with and that we're in touch with every day. So and growing that crowd, basically, right? Growing the momentum, so that there are more people to put forward what Wayne just said. You know, we're on the right side of history, but we need a lot of people to say that in a lot of different contexts and to a lot of different companies and organizations. So, and Wayne, thank you so much for spending time with us on this Friday morning. I wish you a great day, and for sure we will be back in touch very soon. And
yes, thank you. Thank you for hosting this, and nice to meet those of you who joined us. I hope that I will see you in person at the workshop. I might just do something cheeky to end. I usually do this, and that's to end with some poetic words, because I noticed you profiled a little bit the radical activist, which was one of my freshly baked, and this is what it's about. So if you're okay with that, and if people have another 2 minutes, I'm going to just end with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So a poem called Radical Activist that I wrote. You call me a radical activist, condemning my actions as touting extremes. No doubt there's a need for instruction, for it's high praise if you know what it means. What else should I be if not radical? For radical means to go back to the roots. A farmer begins by preparing the earth, and seeding the soil in time brings new shoots. You call me a radical activist for the problem, for the sourcing of the problem and the ultimate cause. No doubt it results in disruption or blocking and breaking unjustified laws. And what else should I be if not active? I'll be passive enough when I'm done and dead. The world needs a shake-up to wake it, and the legacy ways, like leaves, must be shed. You call me a radical activist, and I thank you kindly for this accolade. No doubt it's the path of construction, of shaping and shifting our future remade. So thanks again. I hope to see many of you in person in November. Thanks, Oleg.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye, Will.